The unified hierarchy of the Godhead is something like other aspects of the Godhead that cannot be seen. Yet God wants us to see those things, or at least understand those things. So He's created physical illustrations of His unified hierarchy, and in particular placed those illustrations in the biological world. I believe in the case of the unified hierarchy, He illustrates that with biological hierarchy. In particular, something I call the netted hierarchy of life. We're going to look at the hierarchy of biology a couple of different ways, or actually a couple different types of biological hierarchies. First, what we're going to do is look at the hierarchy itself, the easy to understand hierarchy. Then we're going to look at the unified, netted aspect of the hierarchy. So looking at hierarchy, simple hierarchy from the top to the bottom, let's look at organizational hierarchy of biology. Here, there's an organizational hierarchy for everything in the universe, everything that God has created. He's created with a hierarchy of organization or a hierarchy of parts. For example, what we've already seen in the non-living world, we've seen that subatomic particles, really small particles, are combined together to create something a bit larger, atoms, and atoms are combined together to create something a little bit larger, molecules. This exists in all things, whether they're in the biological world or the non-biological world. These are three tiers of hierarchy. Three levels of hierarchy, from subatomic particles to atoms to molecules. There are three tiers of hierarchy that are found in every created thing. Biology adds more tiers of hierarchy, more complexity than is found in the non-biological world. And in fact, there's a number of tiers, and we're going to step our way through the tiers of hierarchy in biology. We're going to begin with arguably the lowest tier of organizational hierarchy, and that is metabolism. Metabolism is the set of processes in organisms that on an extremely small micro scale actually produces the food for organisms or releases the energy from food so that organisms can survive, and also builds their macromolecules, breaks down their macromolecules, and does all of the housekeeping duties of the very small in organisms. These metabolic processes, these activities of metabolism, require essentially little tiny molecule-sized machines. And analogous to machines we might have in a automobile assembly plant, those machines, to operate well, usually have to be placed on a solid surface, or at least a surface that will allow them not to move around too much, especially to make sure that the machines are in the right order, so that if they have to do something in a sequence, the machines are already in the right order for the sequence to occur properly. And so as a consequence, the machinery of metabolism really needs to be mounted on a floor or a surface. In biology, it's mounted on what are called biological membranes, surfaces that will support these molecular machines. These membranes have some interesting properties of their own. Not only are they nice surfaces to mount our molecular machines, but they do double and triple duty. They do other things for the organisms. One of those characteristics of membranes is that membranes allow certain things through the membrane, but not everything. So they're not quite like a concrete floor of an automobile factory. They are more like, let's say, a grating that you can place things on, but at the same time, air or water can move through it. Biological membranes permit some molecules through the membranes and other molecules not. That turns out to be important in our consideration. Biological membranes are usually built from molecules called phospholipids. We mentioned them briefly when we referred to macromolecules of life. These are type of lipid, lipids being those types of molecules that don't dissolve in water. A type of lipid with a glycerol backbone, 3 carbons. 2 of the carbons are attached to long chains of carbons that are known as fatty acids. And the third one is attached to a phosphate group, or something that's actually dissolvable in water. This gives the phospholipid an interesting structure that turns out to be very important in organisms. That gives the phospholipid 2 legs, if you wish, these long fatty acid chains, sometimes many times larger than what you see here, but here we've got 2 legs, if you wish, of the phospholipid, a body of the phospholipid composed of the glycerol group, and then a head of the molecule that is composed of phosphate and associated phosphor and associated things. This end of the molecule has some electrical charges. This end of the molecule, therefore, likes water. It's hydrophilic. It attaches to water, water attaches to it. The other end of the molecule, however, with these long legs, this part does not like water. It's hydrophobic. It doesn't have any charges. It tries to get away from water if it can. That design, that structure, it results in a very interesting consequence. If you have a bunch of these little fellers, and here they're just shown as having a blue head and 2 yellow legs, if you have lots and lots and lots of them, they get together with the legs against the legs and kick out the water, because the legs don't like the water, they're hydrophobic, and the heads get together with one another and face out towards the water. And they'll end up in these double layers with legs to legs, with heads on one side, heads on the other side, the legs together, legs associated with each other, kicking out the water in between the molecules, so that this side of, and what results is a membrane here, a surface. On one side you've got water, and they're touching the hydrophilic heads, the heads that like the water. On the other side is water. They're touching water. The heads are touching water over there. They're happy, if you wish, over there. In between, you have a double layer of these legs that don't like water. This phospholipid bilayer, 2 layers, feet to feet, actually automatically results from throwing a bunch of these phospholipids into water. They just automatically gather together in this sort of fashion, because one end of the molecule likes water and the other does not. Actually, if you have enough of these, it doesn't just do this, because this isn't very comfortable. It would leave an edge here up against water that the molecules wouldn't like. If you have enough of them, what it actually produces is a sphere, a surface that makes a complete sphere shape. Inside the sphere you've got water, outside the sphere you've got water, and the sphere itself is this double layer of legs that do not like water. Another characteristic of this phospholipid bilayer is it's flexible. These little guys are attracted to each other and to water by very weak electrical charges. So although they do like to get together, they're not like solidly bond together. You can literally stick your finger in here, they all move aside, and you can stick your finger through and pull it back out again, and it self-repairs itself. It'll recover and close up the hole, which is kind of cool. But also the whole structure is flexible. It can wave in the water. It can you can change the shape of this fairly easily if you wish. And so sometimes they're called plasma membranes. because they are flexible like a plasma. Biological membranes are the foundation for all organisms. All organisms have biological membranes. All organisms are built from membranes that are developed from phospholipids. So a very basic level of organization of all organisms, at the most basic level, we have metabolism, very small molecules doing the work of machines that are set on membranes. These membranes arrange themselves into spheres or sphere-like structures that we're going to come to recognize as cells, creating the next level of organizational hierarchy of life. And speaking of these cells, these turn out to be what are called the units of biological life. We're going to look at the history of these concepts, but it turns out that we have come to realize that cells make up all organisms. Or putting it another way, all organisms are made up of cells. And the cells are themselves made of biological membranes, these plasma membranes, these phospholipid bilayer membranes. And so for a moment here, we're going to look at the relationship between cells and the membranes. I'm going to deal with the issue of an organism's size. And you've either had a lab or will have a lab on surface area and volume. And that lab will be very helpful. If you haven't had that lab, by the way, probably be a good idea to do that lab now. Before you fully understand this material, you might could use the information you gain from that lab. As an organism increases in size, its volume increases in size. That makes sense. But it turns out that as the organism increases in size and its volume increases and its surface area increases, if you look at how fast the surface area increases as the organism grows, the volume increases faster. So although both of those, volume and surface area, increase with growth, the volume increases as the size dimension of the object raised to the third power, and the surface area raises or increases as the linear dimension of the organism to the second power. So if you double the size of an organism, you will increase the volume of an organism 8-fold, but you'll only increase the surface area 4 times. So as you increase the size of things, the volume increases faster than the surface area. Now the consequence of that is that if the organism's metabolism occurs on the membrane, basically through machines that are stuck on the membrane, and the membrane, which is the surface area around the cell, increases slower than the volume does, then you're going to end up with a problem. Because the volume of the cell will in fact determine how much energy the organism needs, for example. But if all the energy producing molecules are mounted on the surface area, then as the organism grows, the surface area is not going to grow as fast as the volume, so the surface area is not going to be able to produce enough energy to supply the energetic needs of the whole cell as the cell grows. So as a cell grows, you need more and more energy that cannot be produced ultimately by the surface area around the cell. So as an organism increases, there's a point at which it can no longer supply in its surface area around the cell the energy that is needed by the organism. At this point, the organism has gotten as big as it can get if all of its molecular machinery is mounted on the outside of the cell. This results in 3 different kinds of organisms on the planet, 3 different major groups of organisms on the planet. Those organisms, in the first case, that the only membranes they have in the cell are the membranes around the outside of the cell. Those organisms are called bacteria. They do all their metabolism, they produce all their energy, they produce all their macromolecules, they break down all their macromolecules, they do all their metabolism on the outside membrane of the cell. Because they're restricted to doing it there, those kind of organisms can only get so big. Once they get to that maximum size, they cannot exceed that because they don't have enough molecular machinery, surface area, to supply the needs of the cell. So these kinds of organisms, bacteria, are extremely small. They are only the size of microns, really a micron or 2 in size, 1/1,000,000th of a meter in size. If they get any bigger than that, they can't supply their own needs. If an organism is to be bigger than that, and let's say still to be just a single cell, then the organism needs to put membranes inside the cell. So as the cell increases in size, it adds membranes inside the cell. These membranes produce little round or other shaped objects inside the cell called organelles that can produce all sorts of extra surface area for the cell to get its energy, to make its molecules, to break down its molecules, etc. So as you get bigger than a bacterium, you end up having a cell that doesn't just have an outside membrane, it has inside membranes as well. It has organelles inside the cell with membranes. And that works up to a certain size, but there's a point at which, as you increase the size of the cell and increase the number of membranes inside the cell, you're going to run out of room for membranes. The cell is just going to get full of membranes, and you won't be able to get past a certain point. So there's basically a theoretical limit. There's a limit to how big a cell can get, even when it puts membranes inside the cell. So a second type of organism are those that not only have membranes on the outside of the cell, but have membranes on the inside of the cell. They have organelles inside the cell. These are the protozoa and many of the algae. These organisms can get up to 10 times the size of a bacterium. They can get 10, 20, they can even get as much as 100 microns in size. 1/100,000,000th of a meter in size. But there's a limit there. If you were going to be bigger than that, the third group of organisms on the planet are things that are made that are bigger than, and still, the organism that's 100 microns in size can't be seen by the naked eye. It's still too small to be seen. For organisms to be as big as humans, to be as big as rabbits or even earthworms, you need to make those organisms from multiple cells. You've got to stick a bunch of cells together to create them. That then will allow you to get to extremely large size. So based upon metabolism's need to be done on the surface area of cells, on the membranes of cells, it allows us to divide life into 3 major groups. The bacteria, where they only have a membrane on the outside of the cell and no organelles, and they're only one cell. The one-celled eukaryotic organisms, eukaryon, eu means true, karyon means body. These are cells that have true bodies inside the cell. They have organelles inside the cell. These are cells with membranes on the outside of the cell and inside the cell. They include, and still are one-celled. These are protozoa and most algae. And then the third group are the organisms with multiple cells that can grow to very large size. The first 2 types, the bacteria and the eukaryotic single-celled organisms, were unknown before the microscope because they're very small. They can't be seen with the naked eye. At the time, the beginning of the 17th century, for example, the only organisms people knew about were in fact the third category of organisms made of multiple cells. In 1665, though, Robert Hooke used a newly discovered or developed microscope to look at, in this case, cork, and realized that under the microscope he's finding little tiny cavities, little tiny rooms. He thought they kind of looked like the rooms that monks lived in monasteries. And the rooms that monks lived in monasteries were called cells. So he looked at those things and said, those look like cells. I'm going to name them cells. He was the first one to use the name cell to describe the structure we now know as a cell in organisms. The microscope not only showed us the cells of large organisms like plants, but it also revealed or began to reveal the organisms of the second category, the eukaryotic single-celled organisms, the algae and protozoa, that people didn't know about at all. But it took another 200 years for people to recognize that the cells that Hooke found were not just found in cork or a few organisms. They were in fact part of every organism on the planet. In 1837, Matthias Schleiden saw plant cells that actually developed from other plant cells. Plant cell divided and produced a new plant cell. Not too long after that, a decade after that, Theodor Schwann expanded Schleiden's observation on plants and extended it to other cells, to all cells. He, in fact, suggested that maybe all organisms, regardless of their size, regardless of whether they are plants or animals or algae or protozoa, that all organisms are made of cells. And perhaps some other things made by cells, but that ultimately organisms are all constructed of cells. In 1858, Rudolf Virchow, so just a few years after that, also carried that a little bit further by saying not only are all organisms made of cells, but the cells of all organisms come from other cells. So cells only are generated from cells. This led to the development of what we now call cell theory. And this is a theory. This has never been proven to be true because we've never examined every single organism on the planet and every single cell to indicate that this is true for everything, although it's been seen in everything that we've observed, so it appears to be something that is generally true. Cell theory made these claims. First of all, every organism, no matter what it is, small or big, is made of at least one cell. It's either a one-celled organism or a multi-celled organism. All organisms are made of cells. 2, the cell is the smallest unit of biological life. Here the idea is our bodies are made of trillions of cells. The claim here is that every cell in our body is a living thing in the sense of biologically living. That wouldn't be biblically living, that would be biologically living. Each cell is biologically alive, but the claim here is that no component of a cell is itself biologically alive. So a cell might have organelles in it, but the organelles are not alive, only the cell is alive. The smallest biologically alive organisms are cells. Third claim is that every cell comes from another cell. A cell divides to produce a new cell, that cells come only from pre-existing cells. Virchow basically made all of these claims and introduced these claims as cell theory. Since the time of Virchow, for the past couple hundred years, we have verified each of these, except for a bit of a variation. We have discovered, more recently, the existence of things called viruses. Viruses are extremely small, much smaller than bacteria. They aren't made of cells. But biologists debate about whether they're living organisms or not. They do some of the things that living organisms do, but not all of the things. So some people are inclined to say cell theory is still true. All organisms are made of cells, and viruses are not made of cells, so viruses aren't alive. There are some people who would argue that viruses are biologically alive. There's a debate on that, one way or another. But aside from viruses, as far as we have been able to tell, every other organism on the planet that is biologically alive is made of cells. The cells in that organism are the smallest unit of biological life, and every cell comes from the division of pre-existing cells. Since the time of Virchow, we can add a few more things that are also true of all cells and all organisms. An organism's metabolism occurs only inside cells. Metabolism does not occur outside of cells. For example, we got lots of cells, trillions of cells, but the metabolism doesn't occur between our cells. Our metabolism occurs within our cells. Fifthly, DNA carries all the hereditary material, and it's found in cells. So heredity, inheritance, all is found within cells. And since cells come from other cells, it turns out that the hereditary information comes from the parent cells that came before the cells that we see. And finally, in the sixth place, cells have very similar chemistry to each other. And in the next session, we're going to look at characteristics of cells. Characteristics cells have in common, and we see that there are a number of things that all cells have in common and find together.